The cruelest people are often the ones most confident nobody can understand them. Rain pressed softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Han River Private Dining Club, while golden chandelier light reflected across polished black marble and crystal wine glasses worth more than most monthly salaries. Seattle's elite rarely entered places like this without invitation. Senators waited months for reservations. Professional athletes quietly disappeared into private booths upstairs. Billionaires used the restaurant to speak freely because every waiter signed confidentiality agreements thicker than apartment leases. And tonight, every table in the private dining room belonged to Daniel Kong. The Korean Mafia Boss sat at the center of a 12-seat ebony table wearing a charcoal suit, so perfectly tailored it seemed sculpted onto him rather than stitched. 42 years old. Controlled. Untouchable. The kind of man who could silence rooms simply by lowering his eyes. Around him, investors and foreign business partners laughed carefully at jokes they did not fully understand, while waiters moved silently through warm amber light, carrying Wagyu steaks and $1,000 wine bottles. Daniel barely noticed the food. He never came to places like this for pleasure anymore. Power had a way of making even luxury feel repetitive. Another bottle, one investor said while adjusting his cufflinks. Simone Carter stepped forward immediately from beside the wine station, carrying a fresh bottle against the soft black fabric of her uniform apron. Her movements were smooth, calm, almost invisible. Daniel noticed that first. The best waitresses in luxury restaurants learned how to disappear while standing directly beside wealthy people. Simone poured wine carefully around the table while conversations drifted between English, Korean, and Japanese business slang. She never interrupted. Never inserted herself, just listened quietly beneath warm chandelier light, while rain traced silver lines down the windows overlooking downtown Seattle. Then Daniel glanced toward one of his younger investors and spoke casually in Korean. "She is beautiful for a waitress." A few men at the table chuckled softly into their whiskey glasses. Daniel continued without lowering his voice. But beauty and intelligence rarely survive in the same person at her income level. More laughter. Quiet. Polite. The kind rich men used when cruelty disguised itself as sophistication. Simone continued pouring wine without reacting. Not even a flicker across her expression. Daniel noticed immediately. Most people changed after becoming the subject of conversation. Shoulders tightened. Hands shook slightly. Faces stiffened. But Simone simply moved toward the next glass with the same calm posture as before. That unsettled him for reasons he could not explain. Maybe she understands Korean. One older businessman joked carefully. Daniel glanced briefly toward Simone before answering in Korean again. If she did, she would probably cry by now. Another wave of restrained laughter spread across the table. Simone placed the wine bottle down gently beside the silver tray. Still calm. Still expressionless. Daniel studied her more carefully now beneath the amber lighting. Dark skin glowing softly against the elegant black uniform. Hair pulled neatly away from intelligent eyes that never lingered too long on wealthy guests. Mid to late 20s perhaps. Graceful without trying to be. Educated posture. That was the strange part. She did not move like someone defeated by service work. She moved like someone temporarily visiting it. "Excuse me," Simone said softly while replacing a water glass near Daniel's elbow. Her voice carried warmth without submission. Daniel found himself watching her hands for half a second longer than necessary. No trembling. No nervousness. Just quiet precision. One investor leaned closer toward Daniel while Simone stepped away. "You are being cruel tonight." Daniel swirled whiskey slowly inside his crystal glass. People reveal themselves when they think nobody understands them. The investor frowned slightly. And what exactly has she revealed? Daniel looked toward Simone again across the private dining room. She now stood beside another table, helping an elderly couple choose dessert, while soft jazz floated through the restaurant air. Still composed. Still unreadable. Daniel lowered his voice slightly before answering in Korean. "That she knows her place." The moment the sentence left his mouth, Simone paused very briefly beside the dessert cart. Barely noticeable. One tiny stillness lasting less than a second. But Daniel saw it. And suddenly, for reasons he could not explain, the rain outside no longer sounded relaxing. The private dining room grew louder as the night deepened, but the warmth inside the Han River Club no longer felt comfortable to Daniel Kong. Something about that brief pause near the dessert cart continued bothering him long after the conversation should have moved on. Rain still tapped softly against the windows overlooking downtown Seattle, while jazz piano drifted through golden chandelier light. Around the ebony table, investors discussed international shipping routes and luxury hotel acquisitions between expensive whiskey pours and perfectly plated steaks. Normally, Daniel controlled rooms like this effortlessly. Tonight, his attention kept drifting towards Simone Carter. She moved quietly between tables, carrying trays balanced carefully against one shoulder, while the soft black fabric of her uniform reflected amber light. Every movement looked disciplined, intentional. She smiled politely when spoken to, but never performed fake warmth the way many service workers did around wealthy guests. Daniel noticed that too. She treated millionaires exactly the same way she treated elderly couples or exhausted tourists. Calm professionalism. Nothing more. "You are distracted," one investor finally observed while cutting into a filet mignon. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "Am I? You have been staring at that waitress for 20 minutes. Quiet laughter spread around the table again. Daniel reached for his whiskey glass without responding immediately. "I dislike unreadable people," he said finally in Korean, "especially in places built around obedience." One older businessman frowned faintly. "She is a waitress, Daniel, not a spy. That is exactly why it is strange." Daniel's eyes followed Simone again as she helped another server reorganize wine glasses near the kitchen entrance. Most people react when insulted. Maybe she truly does not understand Korean. Daniel swirled amber liquid slowly inside the crystal glass. Maybe, but he no longer believed that. A few moments later, Simone approached the table again, carrying fresh espresso cups arranged neatly on a silver tray. The investors shifted slightly to make room, while expensive watches glimmered beneath chandelier light. Daniel watched her carefully this time, searching for signs. Any indication she understood what had been said earlier. But her expression remained composed. "Your espresso, gentlemen," Simone said softly while placing cups around the table. One younger investor attempted an awkward smile. "Long night for you." Simone nodded politely. "Busy nights are usually good nights." Daniel spoke suddenly in Korean before she could step away. "Ask her if she enjoys serving arrogant men." The younger investor froze immediately. "Daniel." Another businessman lowered his eyes toward the table. Even among wealthy men, there were moments when cruelty became uncomfortable to witness. Simone continued adjusting spoons beside the espresso cups. Still no reaction. Daniel studied her profile beneath the warm lighting. "Maybe she is used to disrespect," he continued casually in Korean. "People stop feeling humiliation once they expect it every day." The words settled heavily across the table. Nobody laughed this time. Simone finally lifted her eyes briefly toward Daniel. Calm, steady, almost thoughtful. Then she turned toward the youngest investor sitting nearest the window. His Korean pronunciation, while thanking another guest, had been clumsy all evening. Simone gently adjusted the angle of the espresso saucer before speaking softly in perfect Korean. "You should use the formal honorific ending in that sentence." Silence hit the table instantly. Absolute silence. One investor nearly dropped his spoon against the saucer. Another man slowly lowered his whiskey glass halfway to the table without blinking. Daniel did not move at all. Simone looked toward the younger investor kindly, as if correcting grammar were the most natural thing in the world. Otherwise, she continued fluently in Korean. "It sounds unintentionally disrespectful toward elders." The younger man stared at her speechless. Daniel felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. Not anger. Something far more unfamiliar. Exposure. Simone finally turned toward him fully for the first time that evening. Her voice remained calm, gentle even. "And your pronunciation of the Seoul dialect is slightly outdated," she added softly in Korean. "People under 50 rarely speak that way anymore." Nobody at the table breathed. Rain pressed harder against the windows now, while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond downtown Seattle. Daniel Kong suddenly became aware of every cruel sentence he had spoken over the last hour. Because the woman he believed invisible had understood every word from the beginning. The silence inside the private dining room lasted long enough for the rain outside to become painfully loud. Nobody touched their espresso. Nobody lifted a fork. Crystal chandeliers continued glowing warmly above the ebony table, while soft jazz drifted through the restaurant. But the atmosphere had changed completely. Daniel Kong sat perfectly still with one hand resting beside his untouched whiskey glass. For the first time in years, he could not immediately control a room. Simone Carter remained standing beside the table, holding the silver espresso tray calmly against her waist. No anger, no smugness. That somehow made the humiliation worse. One investor cleared his throat awkwardly. Another suddenly became deeply interested in his napkin. Wealthy men who laughed comfortably 5 minutes earlier now avoided eye contact entirely. Daniel finally spoke in Korean, his voice lower now. "How long have you understood us?" Simone answered without hesitation. "Since the appetizers." Another silence followed, heavy this time. Daniel studied her carefully beneath the chandelier light. "And you listened anyway?" Simone adjusted one espresso spoon slightly beside a saucer before responding. People are usually most honest when they believe they are safe from accountability. The sentence landed like a quiet blade across the table. One older businessman actually winced. Daniel felt heat rise beneath his collar for the first time in years. Not rage. Shame. Unfamiliar and deeply irritating shame. "You should have said something earlier," one investor muttered nervously. Simone finally looked toward him with gentle professionalism. "Why?" The man blinked in confusion. Simone's voice remained soft. "So the conversation could become less honest?" Nobody answered. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair while watching her with growing disbelief. She was not defending herself, not demanding apologies, not weaponizing the moment. If anything, Simone looked disappointed rather than wounded. That unsettled him more deeply than anger would have. "Where did you learn Korean?" Daniel asked finally. Simone met his eyes directly for the first time that evening. Calm dark eyes beneath warm restaurant lighting. Intelligent eyes. "Seoul," she answered simply. Several businessmen stared openly now. Daniel frowned slightly. "You lived there?" "For 6 years." "Doing what?" Simone's fingers tightened almost invisibly around the silver tray. Barely noticeable, but Daniel saw it immediately. "Studying." One younger investor suddenly laughed awkwardly from pure discomfort. "This evening has become very educational." Nobody joined him. Simone turned politely toward the center of the table. "Would anyone like fresh espresso?" The normalness of the question inside such brutal silence almost felt surreal. Daniel watched her carefully while the investors slowly shook their heads. She moved to collect empty cups one by one with the same calm professionalism she carried before the reveal. No dramatic exit. No revenge speech. Just dignity. Somehow that dignity made Daniel feel smaller every second she remained near the table. As Simone reached toward his untouched espresso cup, Daniel spoke quietly in Korean again. "Did you hate us while we spoke?" Simone paused briefly beside him. Not dramatic. Just still. Rain streaked silver down the windows overlooking downtown Seattle, while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline. Then she answered softly in flawless Korean. "No." Daniel looked up slowly. Simone's expression remained unreadable. "I felt embarrassed for you." The entire table froze again. One investor actually lowered his eyes toward the marble floor. Daniel stared at Simone without speaking, because somehow that sentence hurt more than outrage ever could. Not angry. Not defensive, embarrassed for him, like watching someone powerful willingly become small. Simone finally lifted his untouched espresso cup onto the silver tray. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Mr. Kong." Then she walked away through warm amber light toward the kitchen entrance while every eye in the private dining room followed her in silence. Daniel remained motionless beside the empty espresso saucer long after she disappeared behind the swinging doors. Across the table, nobody dared speak first. The Korean Mafia Boss slowly reached for his whiskey glass, but halfway there, he stopped. Because for the first time in years, his own reflection in the crystal looked unfamiliar to him. The atmosphere inside the Han River Private Dining Club never fully recovered after Simone walked away from the table. Conversations returned eventually, but too carefully now. Every laugh sounded restrained. Every business discussion carried an uncomfortable awareness lingering beneath the crystal chandeliers. Daniel Kong remained seated at the center of the ebony table while investors slowly resumed talking around him, but his attention no longer followed the negotiations. Instead, his eyes kept drifting toward the kitchen entrance where Simone had disappeared. Rain continued sliding across the towering windows overlooking Seattle, while jazz piano floated softly through warm amber light. "You should let it go," one older businessman finally said quietly in Korean. Daniel glanced toward him without expression. Let what go? Your pride. Another investor exhaled awkwardly into his whiskey glass. She embarrassed you because you embarrassed yourself first. Normally a sentence like that would have ended the evening badly for whoever spoke it. Daniel Kong was not a man people corrected publicly. But tonight he simply sat there staring at the untouched espresso cup missing from his place setting. The absence somehow bothered him more than the humiliation itself. You think I was wrong, Daniel said calmly. The older businessman met his eyes carefully. I think powerful men become dangerous when they stop recognizing humanity in people beneath them. Silence settled again. Daniel hated that the sentence stayed with him. Because somewhere deep beneath years of control and wealth, he recognized the truth inside it immediately. Across the restaurant, Simone reappeared carrying fresh dessert plates toward another private table. She moved exactly the same as before. Calm, professional, unshaken. That unsettled Daniel more deeply than anger ever could. Most people wanted powerful men to know they had been hurt. Simone carried herself like his opinion had never mattered enough to damage her in the first place. Who is she? Daniel asked suddenly. One younger investor blinked. The waitress. Obviously. Another businessman shrugged slightly. Probably just an employee. Daniel continued watching Simone through the warm restaurant lighting. No, he lowered his whiskey glass slowly onto the marble table. People with that level of fluency do not accidentally become waitresses. One investor attempted a nervous laugh. Maybe she married badly. Daniel ignored him completely. Something about Simone's composure continued bothering him in ways he could not explain logically. Not arrogance. Not revenge. Discipline. The kind built through years of restraint. Then suddenly, from across the dining room, a wealthy customer snapped his fingers impatiently toward Simone near the dessert station. Miss, the man called loudly. You forgot the extra forks. Daniel watched Simone pause beside the dessert cart before calmly walking back toward the customer with fresh silverware balanced carefully in one hand. No irritation crossed her face. No visible humiliation. Just quiet professionalism beneath soft chandelier light. Thank you. The customer muttered distractedly without even looking at her properly. Simone nodded politely and stepped away again. Daniel frowned slightly while watching the interaction. That should bother her, he muttered almost to himself. What? An investor asked. Daniel's eyes remained fixed across the restaurant. The disrespect. The older businessman beside him folded his napkin carefully. Maybe she learned long ago that dignity does not disappear simply because other people fail to recognize it. The sentence landed heavily in Daniel's chest. Across the room, Simone quietly helped an elderly couple into their coats while smiling warmly at something the older woman said. Genuine warmth this time, not performed politeness. Daniel noticed the difference immediately, and somehow that realization disturbed him most of all. She was capable of warmth. She simply had not offered any to him. One of Daniel's bodyguards approached discreetly beside the table. Sir, your car is ready whenever you wish to leave. Daniel nodded once, but did not stand. Instead, he continued watching Simone move gracefully through the restaurant beneath golden light while rain blurred the city skyline outside. Then, without fully understanding why, he spoke quietly in Korean. Find out who she really is. The bodyguard hesitated briefly. Sir. Daniel finally rose from the table, adjusting the sleeve of his charcoal suit carefully. People do not carry themselves like that without a story. Across the dining room, Simone looked up at that exact moment. Their eyes met briefly through warm amber light and falling rain beyond the windows. No anger, no fear, just calm recognition. Then she turned away first and continued working while the most powerful man in the restaurant suddenly realized he no longer understood the room he once controlled so easily. Seattle looked silver beneath the rain after midnight, while Daniel Kong sat alone inside the back seat of a black Mercedes watching blurred city lights slide across the windows. Normally nights like this ended with numbers, contracts, power, expansion plans. Instead, he sat silently replaying one sentence over and over inside his mind. I felt embarrassed for you. The words followed him through downtown traffic like something lodged beneath his skin. Daniel loosened the collar of his charcoal suit slightly while the driver moved through wet streets toward the penthouse tower overlooking Elliott Bay. Across from him, His bodyguard waited with a tablet resting on one knee. "We found information on Simone Carter," the man finally said carefully. Daniel lifted his eyes slowly. "That was fast. She does not hide much." Daniel held out one hand. Rain tapped softly against the vehicle roof while the bodyguard passed over the tablet screen, glowing faintly in the dark interior. A university photograph appeared first. Simone stood beneath autumn trees wearing a dark academic coat. Younger but unmistakably the same woman from the restaurant. Calm eyes. Intelligent posture. The headline beneath the image made Daniel frown slightly. Northwestern Linguistics Fellowship recipient. Daniel scrolled lower silently. Korean Studies. International Language Theory. Academic Publications. Translation Research. Fluency certifications in 5 languages. 5. Daniel muttered quietly. English, Korean, French, Japanese, and Arabic, the bodyguard confirmed. Daniel leaned back slowly against the leather seat while city lights reflected across the tablet screen. "Why is she working as a waitress?" The bodyguard hesitated briefly before answering. Her mother became ill during graduate school. Simone withdrew from the doctoral program 4 years ago. Another file appeared beside the academic records. Hospital bills, caretaking schedules, debt accumulation. Daniel stared at the numbers silently. Expensive private universities, medical treatments, student loans. The slow collapse of a future happening line by line across glowing blue screens. Her mother passed away last winter. The bodyguard added quietly. Something tightened unexpectedly in Daniel's chest. Outside, rain continued streaking across downtown Seattle while neon reflections blurred through the darkness. Daniel looked back toward Simone's university photograph again. The difference disturbed him most. In the older image, she smiled openly, brightly, not the restrained professional warmth she carried now inside luxury dining rooms. "Anything else?" Daniel asked. The bodyguard glanced down once more at the tablet. Her professors described her as unusually gifted. Another pause followed. One called her the most naturally talented language student he had taught in 20 years. Daniel lowered the tablet slowly into his lap. The silence inside the vehicle deepened. He suddenly remembered every careless sentence spoken across the ebony table earlier that night. People like her should stay invisible. Beauty and intelligence rarely survive together at her income level. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Not because the words sounded cruel now, because they sounded ignorant. The Mercedes finally stopped beneath the towering entrance of Daniel's penthouse building, where polished stone glimmered beneath soft security lighting. Bodyguards moved immediately beneath black umbrellas while the city rain continued falling around them. But Daniel remained seated inside the car for several seconds longer. "Sir?" the driver asked quietly. Daniel looked back down toward Simone's university photograph again, then toward another image pulled from social media years earlier. Simone standing beside an elderly black woman outside a hospital while carrying grocery bags and smiling despite visible exhaustion. No luxury. No protection, just responsibility, quietly carried. "Do you know what the strange part is?" Daniel asked suddenly. The bodyguard remained silent. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the screen. "She never tried to humiliate me back." The bodyguard considered the statement carefully. Maybe she did not need to. Daniel almost smiled at that. Almost. Upstairs, the penthouse waited exactly as he left it earlier that evening. Perfectly clean. Perfectly quiet. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that suddenly felt colder than usual. Daniel walked slowly through marble hallways toward the kitchen where untouched whiskey still rested beside the counter from the night before. He poured another glass automatically before stopping halfway through. Then, after several long seconds, he quietly emptied the whiskey into the sink instead, because somehow the idea of drinking after tonight felt dishonest. And for the first time in many years, Daniel Kong no longer liked the man reflected back at him through the dark penthouse glass. 3 nights passed before Daniel Kong returned to the Han River Private Dining Club. Seattle's rain had finally stopped, leaving the city washed in cold silver light, while luxury cars lined quietly beneath the glowing entrance canopy outside the restaurant. Normally, Daniel arrived with an entourage large enough to shift the atmosphere of entire buildings before he even entered. Tonight, he came alone. No bodyguards, no investors, no private table reservations. Just a dark wool coat against the winter air and exhaustion settling quietly behind his eyes. The hostess nearly dropped the reservation tablet after recognizing him. "Mr. Kong," she said carefully, "your private room is prepared upstairs." Daniel glanced briefly toward the golden dining room, filled with soft jazz and candlelight reflections. "I do not need the private room tonight." The hostess blinked once in surprise. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "Is Simone working?" A strange expression crossed the hostess' face immediately. Caution mixed with curiosity. "She is finishing her shift." Daniel nodded once before moving deeper into the restaurant. Warm amber lighting reflected across polished marble floors, while conversations drifted softly between wine glasses and low music. But unlike previous nights, Daniel noticed things now. The exhaustion in the server's shoulders near closing time. The invisible choreography required to keep wealthy guests comfortable. The way people in expensive suits rarely looked directly at workers carrying their food. He had existed inside luxury so long he stopped seeing the machinery underneath it. Then he saw Simone near the wine station adjusting silverware beside a stack of folded linen napkins. Simple black uniform. Hair pulled neatly away from her face. Calm movements beneath chandelier light. She looked up briefly after sensing someone approaching and froze slightly after recognizing him. Daniel stopped several feet away. Not close enough to corner her. Not distant enough to pretend coincidence. For a moment neither spoke. Soft jazz drifted through the dining room, while candlelight flickered gently against crystal glassware behind them. "You came back," Simone said finally. Her tone remained calm, but carefully guarded. Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Simone waited silently. Daniel suddenly realized something deeply uncomfortable. He negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation. But standing in front of one exhausted waitress after closing hours somehow felt more difficult than any business meeting he had ever survived. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Simone studied him for several long seconds beneath the warm restaurant lighting. "Do you?" Daniel frowned slightly at the answer. Simone folded another linen napkin carefully before continuing. "You already showed me who you were that night. No anger. No bitterness. Just honesty." Somehow that honesty carried more weight than accusations ever could. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly toward the polished floor. "And if I did not like who I was?" Simone paused while adjusting the final napkin. "That would be your burden, not mine." Silence settled softly between them again. Nearby, another server laughed quietly while counting receipts near the register. The normalness of the restaurant continued around them, while something quieter unfolded beneath it. Daniel looked toward Simone carefully. "I read your research paper on language adaptation theory." For the first time since he arrived, genuine surprise flickered across her face. "Small but real. You found that." "It was published academically." Simone crossed her arms lightly against the black fabric of her uniform. "Most people at your table probably think waitresses stop existing after work." Daniel accepted the criticism without defending himself. "Your professor called you extraordinary." Simone's expression tightened almost invisibly. "Professors say many things before life becomes expensive." Daniel looked at her differently now. Not because she spoke Korean. Not because she embarrassed him publicly. Because he finally understood the scale of what she sacrificed quietly while men like him moved through luxury, pretending success existed independently from luck. "Why did you leave academia?" he asked softly. Simone glanced toward the restaurant windows where Seattle lights shimmered beyond the glass. "My mother needed me more than universities did." Daniel felt shame rise again beneath his ribs. Because the answer came without self-pity. No dramatic sadness. Just fact. Responsibility carried silently. Simone finally looked back toward him. "Did you come here tonight searching for redemption, Mr. Kong?" Daniel hesitated. That alone surprised him. Simone noticed immediately. Because intelligent people often mistake guilt for transformation. The sentence landed softly between them, while warm jazz music drifted through the nearly empty restaurant. Daniel stared at her in silence. And for the first time in many years, nobody in the room looked smaller than him except himself. The restaurant closed an hour later beneath soft jazz and dimmed chandelier light, while Seattle shimmered outside the windows in cold midnight blue. Most employees had already left through the back entrance carrying tired shoulders and leftover pastries wrapped in napkins for tomorrow's breakfast. Only a few kitchen workers remained cleaning stainless steel counters behind swinging doors, while dishwashers hummed softly in the distance. Simone stood near the wine station counting receipts beneath warm amber lighting, her black apron folded neatly across one arm now that her shift had ended. Daniel Kong still had not left. He sat alone near the corner table where the evening first unraveled, untouched black coffee cooling beside his hand. No bodyguards. No whiskey. Just silence. Simone noticed him immediately while organizing the final receipts into folders. Most powerful men usually enjoy making dramatic exits, she said without looking up. Daniel almost smiled at that. Almost. Most powerful men are usually trying to convince people they are important. Simone finally glanced toward him. And you are not. Daniel leaned back slowly in the leather chair. Tonight, I am mostly trying to understand how I became someone you could feel embarrassed for. The honesty in the sentence softened something tiny in Simone's expression before disappearing again. She carried her purse toward the employee counter while the restaurant lights dimmed further around them. People become cruel gradually, she said quietly. Usually after too many years of never being corrected. Daniel watched her carefully beneath the low golden lighting. And, what corrected you? Simone paused while slipping paperwork into her bag. Rainwater reflections moved faintly across the restaurant windows behind her. Responsibility, she answered softly. Responsibility humbles people quickly. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. Somehow, every conversation with her left him feeling intellectually stripped bare. Not attacked. Examined. The difference mattered. You could have humiliated me that night, he admitted. Simone gave a small tired shrug. Humiliation only teaches defensive people how to hide better. The sentence settled heavily between them. Daniel suddenly understood why her words continued haunting him after every interaction. She spoke like someone who had already survived enough pain to stop performing intelligence for applause. Simone reached for her coat hanging near the employee lockers. Simple dark wool, slightly worn near one sleeve. Daniel noticed details now that he never would have seen weeks earlier. You worked for years to become extraordinary, he said quietly. And now you carry plates for rich strangers. Simone slipped one arm into the coat calmly. And Daniel frowned slightly. Does that not bother you? She studied him for several seconds before answering. You still think dignity comes from titles? Daniel fell silent immediately because deep down he knew she was right. Simone moved toward the restaurant entrance while snow began drifting softly outside the windows again. Daniel stood instinctively as she approached. Mr. Kong, she said gently, you are not the first wealthy man who assumed kindness meant ignorance. The words carried no bitterness, just truth. Simone reached for the glass door handle before pausing slightly. But you may be the first one intelligent enough to eventually feel ashamed of it. Then she stepped outside into the cold Seattle night beneath falling snow. Daniel remained motionless inside the warm restaurant, watching her disappear slowly down the sidewalk beneath glowing streetlights. No chauffeur waited for her. No luxury car. Just a woman carrying exhaustion quietly home after midnight while the city moved around her. Daniel looked around the empty dining room once more. Crystal chandeliers. Imported wine. Marble floors. Millions of dollars wrapped carefully in luxury and silence. Yet somehow none of it looked impressive anymore. Because for the first time in many years, Daniel Kong had met someone whose self-respect could not be purchased, intimidated, or diminished by wealth. And somewhere deep beneath the armor of power he spent decades building, something uncomfortable had begun cracking open. Not attraction. Not yet. Something far more dangerous for a man like him. Respect. Snow continued falling across Seattle over the next several days, softening the city beneath silver rooftops and blurred streetlights. Inside the Han River Private Dining Club, warm amber lights still reflected across marble floors and crystal glassware exactly as before. Wealthy guests still arrived wearing tailored coats and expensive watches. Servers still moved quietly between tables carrying wine bottles worth thousands of dollars. But something inside Daniel Kong had shifted in ways he no longer knew how to ignore. He returned to the restaurant 3 times that week. Never with investors anymore. Never with entourages. Sometimes he sat alone near the back windows drinking black coffee while pretending to review contracts. Other nights, he ordered food he barely touched while quietly watching the restaurant move around him. Simone noticed immediately, of course. Intelligent people always notice patterns faster than others. But she never acknowledged it directly. She simply continued working beneath the warm chandelier light, with the same calm professionalism as always. That somehow frustrated Daniel more than hostility would have. One snowy evening, near closing time, Daniel sat alone near the piano while soft jazz drifted through the nearly empty dining room. Simone approached, carrying the check folder against her black apron. "You have been nursing the same coffee for 90 minutes, she observed calmly. Daniel looked up from the untouched contract papers beside him. "You noticed?" Simone placed the check gently onto the table. Everyone noticed. Daniel almost smiled again. Almost. Should I be embarrassed? Simone considered the question, carefully beneath the golden restaurant lighting. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether you are here because you are curious about me," she answered softly, "or because you are uncomfortable with who you became around me." The honesty landed directly beneath Daniel's ribs. Outside the windows, snow drifted quietly past glowing Seattle streetlights while the restaurant slowly emptied around them. Daniel leaned back slightly in the leather chair. "Can it not be both?" Simone crossed her arms loosely. Usually when powerful men become curious about women beneath them socially, they mistake fascination for character growth. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly toward the polished table. Again she managed to expose uncomfortable truths without raising her voice once. "You think very little of men like me," he admitted quietly. Simone shook her head almost immediately. "No." Daniel looked up. Simone's expression remained calm. "I think power removes consequences from people for too long. Eventually they stop hearing themselves clearly." The sentence lingered heavily between them while kitchen staff cleaned quietly in the distance. Daniel stared toward the snow outside the windows for several seconds before speaking again. "My father used to humiliate employees in front of guests," he said suddenly. Simone remained silent. "He believed fear created discipline." Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the warm coffee cup. "I hated him for it when I was younger." Simone watched him carefully now. Not with pity, just attention. Daniel gave a quiet, humorless laugh beneath his breath. "Then one night, I heard myself speaking exactly like him." The restaurant seemed quieter after that confession. Even the jazz piano felt softer somehow. Simone slowly pulled out the chair across from him and sat down for the first time since they met. Not as an employee, not as service staff, just as another human being beneath warm chandelier light. Daniel noticed immediately. The gesture mattered. "People inherit cruelty more easily than they inherit kindness," Simone said gently. "Especially men taught that vulnerability weakens authority." Daniel studied her face carefully across the candlelit table. "And what teaches kindness?" Simone glanced briefly toward the kitchen where exhausted staff members laughed softly while stacking dishes after closing. Usually suffering. Silence followed again, but this time it felt different. Less hostile. More honest. Daniel looked toward Simone's worn coat folded neatly beside the chair. Then toward the tiredness beneath her eyes she tried carefully to hide. "You sacrificed your future for your mother," he said quietly. Simone looked away toward the falling snow outside. "I postponed one version of my future." Daniel frowned slightly. "That sounds like something professors would say to comfort disappointment." Simone finally smiled faintly for the first time since meeting him. Small. Tired. Real. Maybe. Daniel stared at the expression longer than necessary beneath the warm restaurant light. Because suddenly he understood something deeply unsettling. Simone Carter was not extraordinary because she spoke 5 languages. She was extraordinary because life had taken almost everything from her without making her cruel in return. Winter settled deeper over Seattle during the following weeks, wrapping the city in gray skies, wet sidewalks, and early sunsets that turned glass skyscrapers gold by 5 in the evening. Inside the Han River Private Dining Club, Daniel Kong became an increasingly familiar presence, sitting quietly near the back windows several nights each week. Staff members whispered about it carefully when he was not looking. Wealthy men like Daniel did not return repeatedly to places without purpose. Yet nobody fully understood what that purpose was anymore, including Daniel himself. He no longer came for business meetings. Most evenings he arrived alone carrying a laptop he barely opened while soft jazz drifted through chandelier light around him. Sometimes Simone served his table. Sometimes she intentionally asked another server to handle it instead. Daniel noticed every time. One particularly cold evening, snow melted slowly against the restaurant windows while Simone organized reservation cards near the hostess station. Daniel sat nearby reading through financial reports beneath warm amber light when raised voices suddenly interrupted the calm atmosphere. A middle-aged customer near the center dining room snapped sharply toward a young waiter carrying wine glasses. "Are you deaf?" The man barked loudly after the waiter misunderstood a drink order. Several nearby conversations quieted immediately. The young waiter froze with visible embarrassment spreading across his face, while other employees avoided looking directly at the scene. Daniel recognized the moment instantly. Power testing weakness publicly. He had seen it thousands of times before. Participated in it too. The customer leaned back arrogantly in his chair beneath the crystal chandeliers. People should learn English before working in expensive places. Silence spread softly across the dining room. The young waiter lowered his eyes toward the floor. Daniel noticed Simone watching from near the hostess station now. Calm. Still. Then the customer muttered something else under his breath in French, assuming nobody nearby would understand him. Cheap labor always lowers standards. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly before he could stop himself. But before he could speak, Simone moved calmly through the dining room carrying a replacement wine glass. The restaurant seemed to quiet around her naturally. She stopped beside the customer's table beneath the warm chandelier light and placed the fresh glass down carefully. Then, in flawless French, she spoke softly enough that nearby guests leaned forward just to hear her clearly. "Respectfully, sir, language ability and human worth are rarely connected." The customer's face lost color immediately. Simone's voice remained gentle. "Especially since your own French grammar has several errors." Nearby guests suddenly became very interested in their menus. One woman nearly smiled into her champagne glass. The customer stared speechless while Simone adjusted the placement of his silverware with perfect composure. And for future reference, she continued in elegant French. Public humiliation usually reveals more about wealth insecurity than sophistication. Dead silence followed. Absolute silence. Daniel watched the customer shrink visibly beneath the golden restaurant lighting while Simone simply nodded politely and stepped away without another word. No triumph. No cruelty. Just dignity. Again, the young waiter stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, staring at her with open gratitude. Simone only gave him a small, reassuring nod before continuing toward another table as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair while something unfamiliar settled heavily inside his chest. Pride. Not ownership. Not attraction. Pride in witnessing someone protect another person without needing applause afterward. Across the dining room, the embarrassed customer quietly requested his check less than 10 minutes later. After he left, the young waiter approached Simone nervously near the service station. Daniel could not hear every word from across the room, but he caught enough. "Thank you," the waiter whispered. Simone smiled faintly while stacking menus beside him. "Nobody deserves to feel small for learning." The sentence lingered inside Daniel long after the restaurant returned to normal conversation, because suddenly he understood the true difference between himself and Simone Carter. Both of them knew how to use intelligence as a weapon, but only one of them understood when not to. The next evening arrived wrapped in freezing rain and low gray clouds drifting above Seattle like heavy wool across the skyline. Inside the Han River Private Dining Club, warm golden light softened the storm outside, while expensive glasses shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers and quiet jazz floated through the restaurant once again. But tonight the atmosphere felt different the moment Daniel Kong entered. Staff members noticed immediately, not because of fear anymore, because the Korean Mafia Boss now greeted employees when passing them. Small nods, quiet thank you responses, tiny human gestures that had apparently never existed before. Simone noticed too, though she said nothing while arranging reservation menus near the front station. Daniel removed his dark wool coat slowly before taking his usual seat near the windows overlooking downtown traffic blurred by rain. One of the younger waiters approached, nervously holding a menu. "Good evening, Mr. Kong." Daniel glanced up from the table. "Good evening." The waiter blinked once, visibly surprised by the politeness. Daniel noticed that reaction too. Another uncomfortable realization. Respect felt unusual to people who worked around power constantly. "Would you like your usual coffee?" the waiter asked carefully. Daniel paused briefly. "What is your name?" The young man looked caught off guard. "Luis, sir." "Then thank you, Luis." The waiter walked away almost confused while Daniel sat silently beneath warm chandelier light, watching rain slide across the towering windows. Across the dining room, Simone pretended not to notice the exchange while organizing silverware into linen napkins. But he saw the slight shift in her expression. Not approval exactly, more like cautious observation. Hours passed quietly beneath soft music and low conversations. Daniel reviewed contracts without reading most of the pages, while wealthy guests drifted in and out through the glowing restaurant. Near closing time, Simone finally approached his table carrying fresh coffee. "Luis looks terrified now," she observed calmly while refilling the cup. Daniel almost smiled. "Why?" "Because powerful men becoming polite usually means something dangerous is about to happen." Daniel looked up at her beneath the amber lighting. "And what if the politeness is genuine?" Simone considered the question while placing the coffee pot back onto the tray. "Then people like Luis will not trust it immediately." The honesty stung because Daniel knew she was right. He glanced toward the young waiter laughing nervously near the kitchen entrance. "How long does that kind of distrust last?" Simone folded one arm across the black fabric of her apron thoughtfully. "Usually until consistency becomes more believable than fear." Rain tapped softly against the windows while jazz piano drifted quietly through the nearly empty dining room. Daniel studied her face carefully. "You always answer questions like a professor." Simone looked briefly amused by that. Old habits survive difficult years. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the coffee cup. "Do you miss it?" Simone fell, silent for several seconds before answering. "Every day." The softness in her voice changed something inside the room instantly. No performance. No guarded philosophy. Just truth slipping out accidentally. Daniel noticed she rarely spoke about herself directly unless honesty cornered her unexpectedly. "Then why stay here?" he asked quietly. Simone looked around the restaurant slowly. Candlelight. Marble floors. Exhausted servers cleaning nearby tables after wealthy guests disappeared back into luxury apartments. "Because grief is expensive," she answered softly. "And survival usually arrives before dreams return." Daniel felt that sentence settle heavily inside his chest. He had spent years believing money solved suffering because wealth insulated people from visible consequences. But Simone spoke about survival like weather. Constant. Unavoidable. Real. Nearby, Luis accidentally dropped a fork while clearing another table and immediately apologized nervously toward the floor. Before Daniel could even react, Simone walked calmly toward the young waiter and quietly helped gather the silverware beside him. "Breathe," she whispered gently enough that only Daniel nearby could hear. "One fork is not a disaster." Luis laughed awkwardly with relief, while Simone handed him the clean silverware back. Such a tiny moment. Yet Daniel could not stop watching it. Because kindness looked different from power. Power controlled rooms through fear and hierarchy. Kindness steadied people without demanding anything in return. Simone returned toward Daniel's table beneath the warm chandelier light. "You are staring again," she said calmly. Daniel met her eyes without looking away this time. "I am learning." Simone held his gaze for one long quiet second while rain shimmered beyond the restaurant windows. Then she spoke softly. "Learning only matters if it changes how you treat people nobody is watching." And somehow, beneath golden light and soft jazz in the middle of a luxury restaurant, Daniel Kong realized that sentence might become the most important thing anyone had ever said to him. By late January, snow no longer surprised Seattle. The city moved through winter with quiet. Endurance now, headlights reflecting across wet pavement, while freezing rain drifted softly between skyscrapers overlooking Elliott Bay. Inside the Han River Private Dining Club, warmth and candlelight continued wrapping wealthy guests in luxury every evening. But for Daniel Kong, the restaurant no longer represented status or business power. Somehow it had become the only place in the city where he consistently confronted the truth about himself. That realization unsettled him more than any threat ever had. Near closing time one Thursday evening, Daniel sat near the windows reviewing shipping contracts while soft jazz floated beneath crystal chandeliers overhead. Simone moved through the dining room, helping staff prepare for the final reservations of the night. The younger employees relaxed more around her now. Daniel noticed that too. She listened when dishwashers spoke, remembered birthdays, quietly covered shifts for exhausted coworkers without mentioning it afterward. Small acts, invisible acts. The kind powerful people rarely noticed because they generated no headlines. You are staring again, Simone observed while setting fresh coffee beside him. Daniel glanced up slowly. I thought we established that I am learning. Simone folded her arms lightly against the black fabric of her uniform. Learning usually includes asking fewer questions and listening more. Daniel almost smiled. This time the expression actually reached his eyes for a second before fading again. Simone noticed immediately and looked briefly surprised by it. There, she said softly. That looked human. Daniel let out a quiet breath beneath his nose. I'm not sure anyone has ever accused me of that before. Simone leaned slightly against the edge of the table while the restaurant glowed warmly around them. That is probably not a compliment. Before Daniel could answer, raised voices suddenly echoed from near the entrance. A wealthy couple stood arguing sharply with the hostess about reservation delays while nearby guests shifted uncomfortably beneath the chandelier light. The husband slammed one palm against the marble podium. Do you understand who we are? He demanded loudly. The young hostess looked visibly nervous. Daniel watched the scene silently from across the dining room. Months ago, he probably would have ignored it completely, maybe even admired the entitlement. But before Simone could step toward the front entrance to help, Daniel stood first. The movement alone quieted half the restaurant immediately. The wealthy husband recognized him almost instantly and stepped backward slightly. Mr. Kong, the man said quickly, suddenly respectful. Daniel approached slowly beneath the warm golden lighting. Calm, controlled, dangerous in the quiet way only truly powerful men could become. The hostess explained your table will be ready shortly, Daniel said evenly. You do not need to humiliate her while waiting. Silence spread near the entrance. The hostess stared openly in surprise. The man swallowed awkwardly. I was only frustrated. Daniel held his gaze calmly. Then be frustrated privately. The room became very still after that. Not fearful exactly, just aware. The wealthy couple quietly returned to their seats without another word. Daniel turned back toward the hostess. Are you all right? The young woman nodded almost immediately, still stunned. Yes, sir. Daniel gave one small nod before returning toward his table beneath dozens of silent glances from nearby guests. Simone watched him carefully the entire time. Not impressed, not charmed, evaluating. When Daniel finally sat back down, Simone approached slowly with unreadable eyes. That was unexpected, she admitted quietly. Daniel reached for his coffee cup. You said learning only matters when nobody is watching. Simone glanced subtly around the dining room. Everybody was watching. Daniel looked toward the frightened hostess, now laughing nervously with another employee near the reservation podium. Not the person who mattered. For the first time since they met, Simone said nothing immediately afterward. The silence between them felt softer now, less guarded. She finally pulled out the chair across from him and sat down again beneath the warm amber light, while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. Do you know what the dangerous thing about intelligence is? She asked. Softly. Daniel looked at her carefully. What? Simone folded her hands together loosely on the table. Intelligent people can explain away almost any flaw in themselves. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly because the sentence struck too close to truth once again. Simone watched him for several quiet seconds before continuing. But kindness is harder to fake consistently. The jazz piano drifted softly through the restaurant, while candlelight flickered across crystal glassware around them. Daniel met her eyes slowly. And have I become kind? Simone studied him carefully beneath the chandelier glow. Then, after one long, thoughtful silence, she answered honestly. I think you are becoming accountable. That usually comes first. February arrived quietly, carrying softer snow and longer evenings across Seattle, while the Han River Private Dining Club continued glowing like gold against the gray winter city outside. By now, Daniel Kong had become part of the restaurant's rhythm in ways nobody would have believed 2 months earlier. Staff members no longer stiffened nervously when he entered. Luis occasionally joked with him while pouring coffee. The hostess smiled naturally instead of carefully. Even the kitchen staff had stopped whispering after he walked past. Respect built slowly in places where fear once lived. And Daniel understood now that rebuilding trust required patience measured in ordinary moments nobody applauded. Near closing time on a quiet Thursday evening, the restaurant sat wrapped in soft jazz and candlelight, while only a few late guests remained near the windows. Simone stood beside the reservation podium, reviewing payroll forms beneath warm amber lighting when Daniel approached, carrying 2 coffee cups. "You forgot yours tonight," he said simply. Simone looked mildly surprised before accepting the cup carefully. "Thank you." They stood together near the front windows while snow drifted softly beyond the glass, overlooking downtown traffic. For a few moments, neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt defensive now, just thoughtful. "You have changed this place," Daniel said quietly. Simone frowned slightly into the steam rising from her. "Coffee. The restaurant existed before me. That is not what I mean." Daniel glanced toward the younger employees laughing softly near the kitchen entrance. People breathed differently around kindness. Simone lowered her eyes briefly toward the cup in her hands. "You are romanticizing service workers now." Daniel surprised himself by laughing quietly at that. A real laugh this time. Small but genuine. Simone noticed immediately. "There," she murmured softly. "That one sounded less expensive." Daniel shook his head faintly while looking out toward the snowy Seattle streets. "You know what I realized recently?" Simone leaned lightly against the marble counter beside him. "Something philosophical, probably." Daniel glanced toward her. "I spent most of my life believing intelligence made people superior." Simone waited silently. "But intelligence without kindness only creates more sophisticated cruelty." The sentence lingered quietly between them while soft piano music drifted through the nearly empty restaurant. Simone studied him carefully beneath the chandelier glow. That realization usually takes people decades longer. Daniel looked toward her fully now. "You already knew it." Simone's expression softened slightly with memory. "My mother used to say education means nothing if it kills your ability to see people clearly." Daniel felt the words settle deeply inside him, because suddenly he understood why Simone carried herself differently from everyone else he knew. Her intelligence never existed to dominate rooms. It existed to understand them. "Your mother sounds extraordinary," he said quietly. Simone smiled faintly into her coffee. "Tired. Warm. Real. She cleaned hospital floors for 27 years. Daniel remained silent. Simone continued softly while snow drifted beyond the windows. She spoke 3 languages, but most people only saw her uniform. The sentence pierced something inside him immediately because it mirrored the night they first met too perfectly. Simone looked down toward the marble floor for a moment before speaking again. "She used to tell me that people reveal their character most honestly when interacting with workers." Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. "Then my character was ugly." Simone did not rush to comfort him. She never did. "It was careless," she answered honestly. "There is a difference." The jazz music softened lower while restaurant staff quietly prepared to close for the evening. Daniel studied Simone beneath the warm chandelier light, reflecting softly against her dark curls and calm eyes. "Why did you keep talking to me after that night?" he asked finally. Simone considered the question carefully before answering. "Because shame can either harden people or transform them." Daniel looked toward her slowly. Simone's voice remained gentle. "And I wanted to know which one you would choose." Silence settled warmly around them while snow continued falling outside across Seattle. Nearby, Louise switched off several dining room lights one section at a time until only the golden glow near the front windows remained. Daniel realized then that somewhere between humiliation and accountability, between arrogance and understanding, the restaurant had quietly become something neither of them expected. Not romance. Not yet. Something steadier. 2 intelligent people learning how to recognize dignity inside each other without power standing between them. March arrived with softer rain and the first hints of spring beginning to touch Seattle's gray skyline. Snow disappeared slowly from rooftops while cherry blossoms near downtown sidewalks prepared quietly for warmer days ahead. Inside the Han River Private Dining Club, the atmosphere felt lighter too. Staff laughed more openly now. Music sounded warmer beneath the chandeliers. Even wealthy guests seemed calmer inside the golden restaurant glow. And somewhere between long winter nights and difficult conversations, Daniel Kong had changed in ways nobody around him could ignore anymore. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. The dangerous arrogance that once filled every room before him had softened into something steadier now. Awareness. One Friday evening near closing time, the restaurant remained unusually busy while rain shimmered softly against the towering windows overlooking downtown Seattle. Simone stood near the reservation podium, helping Louise correct inventory numbers on a tablet screen while candlelight flickered across marble floors around them. Daniel watched quietly from his usual corner table before finally standing and walking toward the center dining room. Several staff members glanced up automatically. Years of fear do not disappear quickly. Daniel stopped beside the wine station beneath the crystal chandeliers and looked calmly across the restaurant. "May I have everyone's attention for one moment?" Soft conversations faded almost immediately. Servers paused beside tables. Kitchen staff glanced through the swinging doors. Even guests looked up curiously beneath the warm amber lighting. Simone slowly turned toward him from near the hostess station, unreadable as always. Daniel stood silently for several seconds before speaking again. "A few months ago," he said evenly, "I sat inside this restaurant believing wealth and intelligence gave me permission to look down on people serving me." Nobody moved. Rain tapped softly against the windows while jazz music continued quietly in the background. Daniel's eyes shifted briefly toward Simone before returning to the room. "I spoke carelessly, arrogantly, and I confused status with superiority." Several employees exchanged surprised glances now. The Korean Mafia boss lowering himself publicly felt almost impossible to witness. Daniel continued calmly. "The truth is simple. I was disrespectful to someone whose dignity exceeded my own." Silence deepened across the dining room. Simone remained still beside the reservation podium beneath the chandelier glow. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "And I think many powerful people spend their lives surrounded by luxury without ever learning how to see human beings clearly." Nobody interrupted him, because everyone in the room understood something unusual was happening. Not performance. Accountability. Genuine accountability. Daniel finally looked directly toward Simone. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for refusing to become cruel after I gave you every reason to." The silence afterward felt almost sacred. No applause. No dramatic reactions. Just dozens of people standing quietly beneath warm golden light while dignity settled softly across the room. Simone studied him for several long seconds before walking slowly toward the center dining room. Her black uniform reflected softly beneath the chandeliers, while candlelight flickered gently across crystal glasses around them. When she finally stopped beside him, Daniel looked almost uncertain for the first time in years. Simone's voice remained calm. "Most people protect their pride more fiercely than their character." Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. "I know." Simone looked around the restaurant softly. "But character is the only thing people remember once power disappears." Somewhere near the kitchen entrance, Louise smiled quietly to himself while pretending to organize menus. Other staff members slowly returned to work beneath the warm restaurant lighting, but the atmosphere had changed permanently now. Not because a wealthy man apologized publicly, because for once, someone powerful chose humility without being forced into it. Simone glanced toward Daniel one final time before returning calmly toward the reservation podium. "Good night, Mr. Kong," she said gently. Daniel watched her disappear back into the rhythm of the restaurant, while soft jazz drifted once more through the glowing dining room. Then, for the first time since that humiliating winter evening months earlier, he smiled without bitterness. Outside, Seattle rain shimmered beneath streetlights while spring waited quietly beyond the city skyline. And somewhere between arrogance and accountability, two strangers had reminded an entire room that dignity does not depend on wealth, language, or status. It simply reveals itself most clearly in the people who refuse to lose their kindness after life gives them every reason to. If this story moved you, do not forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can discover stories where dignity still matters.